Hello, welcome everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. If you're on the East Coast, you've reached the evening hour. If you're on the West Coast, you probably still have a little bit of sunshine left. Give everybody a second to join. Let us know where you're coming from, who you are, maybe your connection. Have you read the book? Introduce yourself in the chat. Let everybody take a minute to log in. Alaska, amazing. Central Michigan, hi Alicia. Hey C, it's always good to see you. See some familiar faces. West Virginia. Ooh, a school nurse. Amazing. Hey, Denise. I love seeing, oh, Cape Cod. I was born on Cape Cod. That's a great place to be.
You were?
I was. Can you believe it?
That explains a lot. You're so chill.
Yeah. Thank you. It's such a compliment.
It is.
All right. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists this evening, Stephen Mills and Dr. Julie Brown-Yao. And we are here for the second part of a three-part series called Honoring Their Voices. And in this series, it's a brand new virtual series that Darkness Light launched actually with this three-part series, which is great. With the goal of amplifying the voices of survivors and others with lived experience of child sexual abuse. And we want to engage and discuss, compelling conversations. This one happens to be around an incredible book called Chosen by Stephen. And we have separated this into three parts because as you read the book, you will see that Stephen has brilliantly separated his lived experience into three parts. So before we get started, and before we do formal introductions, there is a little bit of housekeeping. All participants are muted. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A forum in Zoom or the comments section on Facebook, if you're watching on Facebook. We will try and get to questions at the end. And please don't be shy. Ask questions throughout the whole time. The team, the wranglers, if you will, are making sure that your questions are being captured. The chat is for networking and comments, so please introduce yourself. Let us know if you've read the book or how many times you've read the book at this point, because it's a great book. Please know that this is a safe space and that if you need to talk to someone, if the conversation that we have tonight is a bit much, there are free resources for you. It's 1-866-4-LIGHT. And that is a free hotline, or you can text the word light to 741-741. We get questions all the time. Is this going to be available after? Yes, it is definitely going to be available after. It'll be on our Facebook as well as our YouTube channel after the event ends. And we also translate into Spanish with subtitles. And so it will be on YouTube there. Just give us a little bit of time to be able to do that. So be sure to follow us on social media, both on Facebook and on YouTube. And again, please remain respectful at all times in the chat. We will remove anyone with inappropriate or harmful comments. Like I said, this is a safe space. We respect each other's lived experiences. Everyone's experience is valid. And so we expect those people here to take care of each other while we're here. So thank you for introducing yourself in the chat. Please continue to do so. Comment, hoot, holler, have a great time. In January, we had the first Honoring Their Voices conversation with Stephen and Darkness Light board member Andrea Harner, who is a forensic interviewer at a CAC out in California. And we talked last month more in depth about the issues surrounding grooming and manipulation of the child, about families and organizations, all in relationship to child sexual abuse and Stephen's experience specifically. And tonight, We are here, and again, I'm joined by Stephen Mills, and this time with Dr. Julie Brown Yao, who is a trauma therapist. And we're going to dive into the second part of Stephen's book entitled Flight. Thank you both so much for being with me tonight. Dr. Julie, I would love for you to take a moment to tell us more about your background and the unique work that you do, bringing together different voices and practices and disciplines.
Thank you, Caitlin. Yes, hi everybody. I'm Dr. Julie Brown Yao, and I have a 35-year background in three particular areas. So the first, although I began them, I think, all at once and continue on today, is a study and practice of spiritual traditions and the many different practices in the spiritual traditions of both Eastern and Western traditions. The second is the somatic tradition, so practices like yoga or body-oriented traditions like yoga, but also body-oriented modalities that have emotional processes connected with them. And then, of course, psychology. So a study of psychodynamic psychology, somatic psychology. I eventually did my PhD in depth psychology. Depth psychology being to simplify it, really looking at what lies below our conscious awareness and bringing that to light. In this 35-year study, I really became passionate about understanding trauma, especially developmental trauma. Developmental trauma we could also speak of as complex PTSD, which I might get into a little bit later on. Relational trauma, childhood trauma. So it's got a few different names, but it's really any kind of trauma that happens to us in childhood, any kind of abuse, sexual abuse, of course, maltreatment, neglect. And that's really my passion today in my practice, is working with adults who are living with symptoms, all kinds of symptoms from developmental trauma. And I work in Laguna Beach, where I'm based, in a private practice. But I also work around the world on platforms like Zoom and Skype. And I also work for an organization called Compassionate Care ALS, where we care for people with the diagnosis of ALS and their families in the active dying process and the trauma that comes up around that. It's a great pleasure to be here with Darkness and Light. Thank you so much. One of my passions too is the prevention of childhood abuse of any kind, and of course the healing of it in adulthood. And it's a great pleasure to be here with Stephen, his exquisite book. I know it's touching many people's lives and probably helping change many people's lives. I hope everybody has read it or will read it. And thank you for the invitation, for me being able to be here. Thanks.
It's an honor. Stephen, for those of our audience members who are just joining us for the first time, would you mind just giving a little background on yourself?
Sure. I've been, apart from a writer, I've worked in the public interest sector most of my adult life. I mean, for the past 40 years, largely in the fields of human rights and environmental protection. So advocacy has been what I've done in my professional career, and strangely enough, that has fed into, after writing this book, I've really turned my attention to advocating for children and preventing abuse and supporting victims and getting justice for victims. And so I, apart from partnering with Darkness to Light, I serve as an ambassador for Child USA, which is the leading advocate for children's civil rights. And I'm on the board of Child US Advocacy, which is the lobbying arm of Child USA, which is fighting to reform statutes of limitations state by state. That is to get rid of limitations on when one can get justice for any kind of sexual assault of a child.
And for those of you who are interested, the final part 3 will be with Catherine Robb, who is the executive director of Child USA Advocacy, right, who will be with us to talk all about the justice system and how there is little to no justice for many survivors across the country. So we know from our first conversation that grooming and manipulation of child sexual abuse is calculated and takes time. And in a generalized sense, so much of the conversation in today's world is about healing from child sexual abuse, but there's a lot that happens in the middle that, quite frankly, I don't think we're talking about. And honestly, it's probably because it makes us all very uncomfortable. And we don't want to imagine a child being, sexually assaulted or abused, but then we also don't want to imagine the things that sort of happen in that middle period between realizing and sorting yourself out and coming to a place where you're on a healing journey. And Stephen, I want to talk about that because it literally is the premise of the second part of your book. Do you think that we're going to be able to get comfortable with some of the things that you talked about?
Well, I think we have to, for sure. And I'm so glad you raised it, because so many of the questions I get, from very well-meaning people, especially men, it's very tough for them to understand, for example, why a boy wouldn't just stop an adult from sexually assaulting them or saying no. And so until you understand the child's actual experience, you can't really understand the trauma, much less how to work with it. And part of the problem here is that we bring a lot of adult language and concepts to this issue. Even the term sexual abuse, that's a very adult label that's meaningless to a child, and it doesn't help us get inside what trauma is. So, when I was 13, my brain had absolutely no framework for understanding that a grown adult man could grab my crotch, pull down my pants, and start filleting me, right? That was not in the realm of my world. I had no language for it. So I experienced that as a break in reality. So for me, the phrase break in reality is more true to what happened than sexual abuse, right? And I wrote the book very much from the boyhood point of view, because I think it's important for people to understand what that feels like. And what it felt like was going into shock. My front brain shut down. I mean, I couldn't say no because there were no thoughts happening. I wasn't capable of speech. The primitive part of the brain takes over. And the nervous system in those moments, the nervous system isn't thinking about what is happening. It's reacting in a very primal way. And what my nervous system assumed was that I was being attacked and he was trying to kill me. And so it was more like being attacked by a grizzly bear. And my brain and nervous system prepared to die. And this is what our bodies equip us to do. I got a huge rush of endorphins. These are the body's own self-made opioids. And I was vaulted out of my body. That's what it felt like. And I watched the whole scene unfold from the ceiling, looking down on my body. And this was the beginning of the dissociation that I'd feel for years and years and years. And so, the words sexual abuse don't capture any of that. And for me as a kid, I understood on some basic level, the world as I knew it was gone forever. And it was replaced by something much more terrifying, that felt like a horror movie or science fiction. And it's hard to convey this to someone. I mean, I suppose you can, imagine you're lying in bed at night as an adult and suddenly you find yourself surrounded by aliens who abduct you and sexually assault you, right? I mean, it's safe to say your life is never going to be the same and the world as you knew it is over, right? That's what I mean by a break in reality. And I guess this is the last thing I want to say about it, that it's important to understand that because it's the key to understanding why a child who's been sexually abused for 10 minutes can suffer the same PTSD symptoms as, say, a combat soldier who's under artillery fire for a week. These seem like incredibly different types of assaults, and yet the nervous system experiences these events in the same way. And that's really important to understand.
Incredibly poignant. And so I will look to you, Dr. Julie. Can you explain how disassociation works and how similar or different Stephen's experiences are with other survivors that you've worked with?
I think Stephen's just described it what dissociation is very, very well. Now, there's a whole body of knowledge on dissociation. Obviously, we're speaking about dissociation when we are under threat. And what it allows us to do, what is dissociation allows us to do, but it's not by choice, it's the body or the nervous system doing it for us, is to detach from our body, detach from our emotions, detach from our surroundings, detach from whatever the traumatic experience is, okay, to save our life. There was a psychiatrist called Frank Putnam, and I loved his expression of dissociation. It is the escape when there's no escape. So when a child is perceiving something frightening or is in fear, as they would be when their reality begins to change, as Stephen said, and they perceiving there's nowhere to go. For a small child, there's nowhere to go. For a child or an adolescent who's been groomed, there's nowhere to go. The only escape is to dissociate. And what happens in that dissociation is we may have gaps in our memory where we don't remember anything, or we may have an experience like Stephen of being above the body and looking down. It can numb us out and really is a process that allows us to escape a lot of the terror as it's happening. However, that dissociation continues on, and we can remain dissociated from the body, from our emotions for decades. And there's a really terrible detrimental effect on our well-being and on our health until we begin to get help for that dissociation at whatever degree it's at. And something really important to understand is when we dissociate, we're not thinking about, okay, I'm going to disconnect here because this is frightening. It happens. We say it's non-volitional. It's not by choice. Now, also what's really important to understand, on your last webinar, in the first part of the series, you were talking about how predators are able to sense who may or may not, snap back or fight or say no. So what can happen in our nervous system, beginning in utero, actually, if it's a utero where there's sort of a toxic environment or a toxic womb, the mechanisms for dissociation in the last trimester are already online. But all the way through childhood, if we have a frightening experience, and it could be left alone to cry it out, right? That's an internal threat for a child. And if they're left long enough and over time, they can dissociate. It's a way for them to get away from the internal threat. But what happens, it's lying down a default mechanism in our system, so a default pattern. So if we have a lot of frightening experiences when we're little, and it doesn't have to be sexual abuse, we can have a pattern within us that if something happens frightening later on, we naturally go into the dissociation pattern, right? We bypass fight or flight and go straight to disconnection or a freeze, and then immobility, sometimes an induced paralysis. And I think that's what predators can also spot, both in children and adults, those who might have that capacity that will go straight to dissociation. And if I could just add one more thing, sorry, because I think this is really
like enraptured. Keep going.
When we understand we didn't have a choice, right? It can sometimes take away some of the shame that people will speak about of I didn't fight or I didn't flee. You don't have a choice. The body doesn't let you. And that goes for children, adolescents, and adults.
Wow. I mean, it's an incredible, I've never thought of the point of the connection that people who abuse children can pick up on that. You know, but we do always talk about, and we did talk about, Stephen, with you, how, you know, it was always someone who didn't have a father figure, you know, a single parent. And I think that's you've already experienced that trauma, you know, and so in some way you've disassociated already. So interesting. So let's talk a little bit about, you know, this in the second part of your book. You write about your attempts to numb the pain from your abuse and escape in the trauma you endured. But you didn't necessarily know or think about the trauma for many of those years. You write in detail about your unsuccessful attempts or with drugs, religion, you know, I mean, it was incredible the way that you sort of outline some of the behaviors that you use to sort of navigate that period of your life. You almost describe it even as zombie-like. Mm-hmm. And I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's a very common experience for survivors that is not publicly discussed much.
Right. Yeah, the zombie, it's interesting because that zombie metaphor, although it felt much more real to me than a metaphor, especially in my 20s. But when I wrote the book, I realized that it went back to literally the day after the first time I was sexually assaulted in the woods, you know, far from home. And then the perpetrator dropped me off at home. I had to wake up and go to school the next morning. You know, I was in 7th grade, and something radical had changed, that I suddenly felt like I was in my body, but I wasn't in my body. I was alive, but I was dead. That's the zombie piece. It became much more drastic later on, but in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, you know, the brain is wired for survival. So it, you know, if I'd woken up Monday morning and fully experienced what had happened, of course, my head would have exploded and I couldn't function. But we're wired to function. I mean, that's the miraculous thing. I was able to function. I was able to show up at school, go to my classes, and do what I had to do. But I was going through the motions without any emotion. The feeling I had previously felt about being with my friends and playing sports and feeling good about a class was gone. It was, so that's the, you know, the feeling of, you know, the sort of living dead feeling. And, you know, I describe in the book a couple of scenes in that era where I really felt like I was looking at my life through glass. It was happening, but I wasn't in it. I was outside of it. We take the feeling of being embodied, of being in our bodies, of being centered in ourself and in our life, is a huge assumption. And you don't realize it until you don't have it. Because once you don't have it, it's very tough to get back in it. But it wasn't until 10 years later, I was in my early 20s, that went to a whole nother level. And that's when I discovered that the summer camp director who had abused me for 2 years was abusing other boys in another state. And, you know, I've since learned this is not uncommon for survivors. You sort of develop these coping mechanisms that work to a certain point, and then they don't work anymore. And for me, this was that point. And, you know, my mind could no longer seal off what had happened to me because the truth was right in front of me. I knew this guy was abusing boys still. I hadn't been the only one, and he was still doing it. So everything I had shut out at age 13 came rushing in. All the terror, all the shame, it was fully there, unmediated. And my whole life really became this one gigantic attempt not to feel it, to make it go away. I mean, which of course is why part 2 is called flight. And, you know, when that happened at age 23, I was in Wisconsin. I was a PhD candidate in economics. And within a matter of weeks, I had completely gone off the rails after this discovery about the perpetrator. I was shooting drugs. I was committing petty crimes. And it was really a downward spiral. I mean, I did my very best to erase myself because that seemed more appealing than feeling what I was feeling. At that point, I was actually aware that I felt like a zombie. There was part of me that started to believe I was a zombie because my behavior was so out of control. It was clear to me I had no agency in my life. Something or someone else was controlling my behavior, and I didn't know what it was. I hadn't put the pieces of the puzzle together at all. I didn't understand it had to do with the abuse. And I didn't get that there was a power controlling me, which was the trauma. You know, that would take many more years before, I got into therapy, and that began to change. And also at that point, as I began talking to other men who survived childhood sexual abuse, I realized that my story was not that uncommon. Men tend to go to great extremes to numb the pain for years, often decades, before getting help. And this, of course, can be true for women as well, but men, as we know, particularly in this culture, not good at asking for help. So, if we survive, guys tend to get help in their 30s or 40s, or try. But in the meantime, the suicide rate is 10 times higher than in the general population, because that just seems an easier out than facing the pain.
Absolutely. Dr. Julie, can you tell us how PTSD works? Is it, is there a gender divide? Do males, females, non-binary people, do they react differently? Or is there a shared experience? How does that work?
Well, let me describe post-traumatic stress disorder, but I also want to clarify it or differentiate between complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is becoming more widely used now. So the PTSD can arise out of a traumatic event. The nature of it tends to be impersonal. So a car accident, a fall, witnessing a horrible crime, an assault, maybe a one-time sexual molestation. And that would be called, or PTSD can arise out of that. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder tends to be personal in nature. And it's a lot more complex, given the name, than post-traumatic stress disorder. It needs to be worked with very differently. Because it's more personal in nature, it tends to happen, the trauma tends to happen with a caregiver or somebody that we were meant to trust, or an organization that we were meant to trust. There's usually a betrayal, a relational betrayal involved. And in complex PTSD, there tends to be prolonged trauma, or the trauma happening many times over a long period of time. And so you can see that it's different. And if we are just working with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a lot of elements that are going to be missed with the relational or the childhood relational aspect. And it typically arises from prolonged childhood trauma. And the symptoms can look very much the same. So I'm not really sure if it's gender specific. It's probably history specific, maybe cultural, depending on how a culture looks at any particular trauma. And any kind of help that may have been around after, even if it didn't heal it, which it wouldn't have done if you develop PTSD, but it might not be as severe if some of it is recognized. So it's an important distinction for people to understand when they are seeking help.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume there is not a lot out there right now for the general public about complex PTSD. Are there resources in particular that you recommend, or websites that you recommend that people should look at?
To learn about?
Yeah.
I think there's more and more literature coming out now on the internet, on the web, so people can read up about it and see the difference. And a simpler way to call it is developmental trauma or childhood trauma. And there's a lot more information for the general population, for the general public right now to read about that and learn about that. And the different ways of healing, because in our developing years, we're going to respond differently to abuse or neglect, depending upon the stage we're in. And how many traumas we may have had previously.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Which actually sort of leads me to my next thought, Stephen, or question. Healing and recovery, as Dr. Julie just said, looks different for every individual based on, different things that happen or different timelines, and some might say it's actually never fully complete. And so, I think we obviously experienced your healing journey with you in the book, but, what was or is or continues to be your healing journey?
Yeah, it's ongoing for sure. And it's, really the journey is the reverse of the flight, So in other words, if in part 2 of my book is all about the flight from the escape from the inescapable, then the recovery part is reversing that and going back toward the source of the experience and getting closer and closer to it in order to face it and feel what happened and integrate it. And, when I began going through that in the early 1980s, it was before discussion of trauma. It was before, PTSD as a term had been coined in 81 or 82, when it entered the DSM, but no one was talking about it, and certainly not in therapists were not. It would be a long time before that really entered the lingo of therapy. So for me, there was a lot of trial and error and a lot of dumb luck. And so it began with me, which is different today, because today, of course, we're much more cued in, to the symptoms and the process that Julie is talking about. But for me, I was lucky enough to find my way to a psychiatrist who listened to my symptoms and diagnosed me with shell shock, which was the term at that time, before PTSD was being used. And I, of course, only associated that with being in combat, because that was the source of that phrase. He opened this whole realm of questioning for me of what was the source of this, because I still had not put the pieces together. After many, many months working with him, I was still suffering from the same symptoms, and he sent me to a therapist for sort of traditional talking therapy. And that was really a key moment, because that's when I began putting the pieces together and feeling safe enough in that environment to begin speaking the truth, and sort of reclaiming my own story. And at around the same time, I had a series of girlfriends, and I had never been honest in any of those relationships about what had happened to me. I mean, that was the secret that sort of drove everything in my life, but was completely invisible from my friends and from my girlfriends. And I met the woman who would become my wife at that time when I was in therapy for a year or two. And that was the first relationship where I disclosed and built a relationship built on honesty, and intimacy and trust. And that was a huge, huge, huge deal. And being open instead of hiding, and being accepted, for who I was and what my experience was. And, over the years that followed, I really tried anything and everything that would help me sort of undo what I described before, that feeling of being outside my body and outside my life. I found at the time I didn't understand it. Now I look back and say, oh, I was trying to find safety in my own body. I started doing yoga. I started doing dance. I did all kinds of somatic therapies. I began doing meditating, just to become aware of the patterns of thought, especially shame and terror, so that I wouldn't necessarily get sucked down the rabbit hole, of those spiraling thoughts. And so, sometimes people, other survivors or people working with survivors will ask me, what is it that works? And my answer is, whatever works for you is what works, and whatever you find that helps you get safe in your own body, safe enough to experience what happened to you, the real feeling, the emotionally true feeling, and lets you integrate that into your adult consciousness. That's where recovery happens.
I just want to remind everyone that we do have resources. If you would like to talk to someone, 866-4-LIGHT, you can give them a call, or you can text the word light to 741-741. So, Dr. Julie, what Stephen described, and per usual, his way with words is beautiful. But does that sound similar to what you hear in your practice? I'd love to know what some of your recommendations are for emotional and body practices. Stephen talked about dance and meditation and things like that. Is that sort of along the lines of what you recommend in your practice?
Well, I think everything that Stephen has spoken about is very useful, and I think it's very individual. If we look at what dissociation is, it's disconnection from the body because we're perceiving a life threat. Dissociation is really a preparing to die scenario. And this is why a term like I felt like the living dead is exactly, part of us is out of the body waiting to die or preparing to die. So we leave the body for a reason, because it's a threat. So until that threat, the dynamics of that threat begin to be resolved, we're not going to come back to the body. So an important element is to know healing work isn't about get back in the body. No, we will organically come back to the body when we begin to feel safety, as Stephen was speaking about. So finding a way to feel safe. One of the first things is having a therapeutic alliance. where you have somebody where you can build trust, where you can begin to talk, whether it's a therapist or a friend or a group or a partner, right? That relational aspect is so important because the trauma happens in relationship. And then finding what works depending upon, again, maybe the age that the trauma took place or what the symptoms are. But safety, boundaries, relationship are really the key foundations to beginning that journey. There's some of these practices we may not want to jump into straight away. Meditation, for instance, is a wonderful practice for many people, but it can also be dissociative. And so if you're already dissociated and you sit down to meditate, you can just go further and further away. And the problem with that, or one of the problems with that, is then all of the body systems, these defense systems that are keeping us from remembering what we don't want to remember, relax. And these memories can come up to the surface far too fast. I get a number of calls from meditation centers of people who've remembered these types of traumas from when they were younger that they didn't previously know because of this, right? So we want to be really careful in the practices that we do, that we may have a few practices that support each other, and that it's usually not going to be one thing that heals us, but a number over time. Yeah, a community of support, if you will, if that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think that's why it's apt that we call it a journey, right? What works for you for a while may not work forever, as you talked about coping mechanisms and healing journeys. And I think that's incredibly important. I recognize that we have about 15 minutes left, and you all have asked some pretty phenomenal questions. And so I'm going to transition now to some audience questions. So again, thank you so much for those of you who have contributed. Please don't hesitate to put more questions in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can with the time we have left. And so the first is, Stephen, to you. You talk not only about feeling shame around being unable to fight back or say stop, but the shame surrounding how the body responded by feeling pleasure. Can Dr. Julie, can you talk a little bit about this specific shame and how it can manifest in a person's adult sexual life and how to help those who are hostage by that shame?
Wow, that's a big question.
I know.
And a really important one, because shame it's a horrible feeling. And then we continue to shame ourselves. And again, understanding that in not being able to fight back is not a choice. And when we're children, when we feel so bad about something happening, we often identify to being bad, that we blame ourselves, especially when it's somebody who's meant to be taking care of us, whether it's a parent, a family member, or someone from an organization, is that we have this respect for them, we trust them, and then they hurt us, and a child will naturally think it's because of them, which creates this deep, terrible pain of shame. And so the healing process is really understanding that you did nothing wrong. And of course, that's just words, and saying that isn't going to quite get the dynamic. So it's really helping, finding somebody who can help you understand that you did nothing wrong. It feels that way. And that your body responded biologically, right? And just like dissociation can be automatic, the pleasure in the body is automatic. It's a biological response. It doesn't mean anything about you liking it or disliking it. But of course, shame comes up around that because people don't quite understand it. And there is ways of being able to heal, like on this journey, reclaim your sexuality and your comfort in it without any shame. So I hope that touched into answering that in some way.
It's an incredible question, but complicated for sure. There are actually two questions about trust. And one, I think, is tailored to you, Stephen, sort of asking you, how do you still have trust issues? How are you coping with trust issues? Do you have guilt when you can't talk about it? And then I think the other, Dr. Julie, is really, this person is asking specifically about men, but thinking through trust issues for men and who are looking to have relationships, positive relationships in their life. So Stephen, maybe you take the first question, talk a little bit about your personal experience with that, and then Dr. Julie sort of dovetail.
Yeah, trust is definitely one of the first things that gets sacrificed because, as Julie pointed out, it's in complex PTSD, it's the sense, it's not just the bodily violation, it's the betrayal at the heart of it that's really the hardest thing to get to. And I know plenty of survivors of my age who are still unable to really look at what happened because the confusion is so deep. We tend to forget that by the time a kid is sexually abused by a perpetrator, if it's in, say, a youth serving organization like mine was in a camp, this person has established a deep emotional bond with you. And so that bond doesn't simply go poof. You may realize something horrific happened, but you're desperately trying to maintain that bond that was developed because that is relationship, and that preceded the assault. And so that confusion of this almost Jekyll and Hyde, wait, there was this good, protective, all-knowing, loving parental figure who is also horrifying and terrifying and hurting me. That cognitive dissonance is almost too much, for the mind to bear. And so, the natural, again, the mind wants to shut down, which is what it does, and the ability to trust anyone else is just so deeply impaired. I had such a hard time, especially with men, trusting any kind of male authority figure, but even my own peers, because again, the nervous system's all about survival. If you're attacked once by a male, you're on full DEFCON alert, for years or decades around anyone who fits in that, what the brain perceives as that threat category. And so, that again, that took a long, long time to unwind, and it had a lot to do also with getting back inside my body, finding my own sense of self and power, connecting with my own story and this experience as a source of strength, not a source of weakness, right? So, for example, being able to write the book and talk about the book, that enables me, because I'm operating more from a sense of, owning that experience, and talking about it, and hopefully talking with other survivors and helping them, that engenders trust. And I am much more inclined, coming from that place of truth and honesty and selfhood, to be able to trust others now.
Yeah, very well said, Stephen. So here's another way to look at what happens to us when we're betrayed by someone who is meant to be taking care of us. It breaks our heart. Right? So our heart is broken, and what do we do if our heart breaks is close it and protect it. And You're not going to want to let anybody else come back in there and risk that heartbreak ever again, because it is so painful. So to trust means to gradually, take away these barriers that are blocking our heart from this profound pain that's happened to us. And so again, finding a relationship or a therapeutic relationship, and slowly over time building that trust, if you will, allows us to begin to open the heart again to trust others and to trust ourselves with that. And Stephen spoke earlier about staying online with his adult consciousness. So especially when there's been abuse in childhood, it's very easy for us to fall back into that child perspective, if you will, and look at the world through that lens, which is absolutely terrifying. And so in the healing journey, in building enough of a sense of self over time, there's various ways to do that. We just can't go into it in such a short time. That allows us to stay present with our own self, while this younger consciousness or these imprints or these memories from childhood allows them to come up without responding to them with such terror as we would if we fall back into that child perspective. And this is really where some magic or alchemy can happen in the body, in the healing process, if we can hold both the adult perspective and the child perspective. Because in the adult perspective, we know in this moment we're okay, we're feeling fear or terror or shame or rage or whatever it might be that's coming up. But we know it's coming from this child experience. We're just carrying it with us through our life. And that enables us to expand our capacity to feel these really strong and volatile emotions and to begin to resolve them in the body where they need to be resolved. Yeah.
Can I ask, this is another audience question, as we think about this complex PTSD, there's obviously the internal experience, that we have with CPSD, but what part does social stigma play in this sort of ecosystem? And I will let either of you respond.
I'll just say something briefly and then let Stephen speak more deeply to it. I often find it depends upon our community or culture that we're living in. I work internationally, so different countries, different communities, and different cultures around the world look upon sexual abuse a little bit differently. So that can have an impact. So Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, it's such an important question because and it's one of the things I'm very much focused on, because most abusive children that happen inside, youth serving organizations, it's usually in the context of, a culture, religion, or a social, some kind of cultural environment that sort of has its own codes of behavior. But what's common across most of them, no matter, for example, if it's in a community of faith, there's a commonality of all too often the victim becoming the pariah, because it's the fact of the abuse, the fact of a person in power assaulting a child is deeply threatening to the power structure and the leadership and the coherence of the community. It's almost too scary to be accepted, much less acted on, and it's much easier to ostracize or excommunicate the victim. And of course, we've seen this over and over again, and not just in the Catholic Church. We saw it. I mean, a huge report out of the Southern Baptist Convention The Jewish Reform Movement just issued a report last week in which it is trying to amend all the wrongs and harms done to children over several decades, and owning up to the fact that instead of being supported, victims were shunned. And so it's almost, you can almost predict that when these things blow up in a community, sadly, that organizations tend to circle the wagons around leadership and people fall in line and the victims wind up outside the circle. And that's just, that's of course what we call, the second wound or the second betrayal. And it's really devastating because of course it's exactly the opposite of what survivors need. Survivors need support. They want people to bear witness to what actually happened, to make amends, for the community to bear witness to the truth. And so when none of that happens, but instead you find yourself cast out, for many survivors, that is way worse than the original assault. And I don't say that lightly. And that's, I hear this over and over again from survivors. They can often, better understand the compulsions and violent behavior of a perpetrator, but trying to comprehend how an entire community, would ostracize victims, that's much tougher to grasp and hurts much more.
Yeah. I think the social stigma around some of the behaviors that people with lived experience go through that you described in flight, the sexually promiscuous, too much drinking, partaking in drugs, those are also things that there's a lot of judgment from the outside without a lot of context around why people are actually engaging in those behaviors. And there's not a lot of empathy for people who, might have substance abuse problems. And so I think, even if we as allies or outside observers, if you will, if someone in our lives is partaking or behaving in that way, checking yourself and sort of asking, how are you judging them, or are you wondering what is behind, that type of behavior? Because that could lead to support and a conversation that could be game-changing for an individual, because people are behaving in a certain way for a reason.
I think that's a really, really important point. And of course, there's a moment in my book when I was in my 20s and going off the rails where a friend said to me, are you looking to get punished? Which of course I was. I mean, the shame was so intense. I was on some deep unconscious level, I would only be happy if I wound up in jail or dead, because that's what felt needed, right, to expiate the sin. And so, yes, I think being aware of those around us when they're acting out in these ways, of being present, if they're, open to talking about what's going on, behind the curtain is super important. I did also want to say, in terms of social stigma, on the good news, as far as I'm concerned, is that I actually think younger generations are much, much more aware of these issues and much more accepting of these, the journeys and the challenges that people face from sexual violence and the toll that it takes and the challenges of trying to heal. I'm blown away when I speak to young people who have this, seems like some kind of collective wisdom, as they do about so many other topics, right? I mean, in terms of gender politics and lots of things, but way beyond, what even where, older generations are today. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Agreed. And that, I think that's there's a number of causes for that, but it certainly wouldn't be, I'd be remiss not to talk about the people who have come before, you know, for decades, pounding the pavement, talking about sexual violence and child sexual abuse and prevention. And we definitely stand on their shoulders and the generations after us as well. So appreciate that point. I am recognizing that it is time to wrap up. I just want to thank you both for such an amazing conversation. As last time, I learned so much. And, you know, Stephen, again, I know you know this from me, but collectively, you know, I want to say thank you, and we honor your voice and your story and your words. And thank you for sharing it with us, because we get to have this incredible conversation, albeit difficult. It is 100% worth it. And thank you for allowing Darkness Slate to be a part of it. For those of you who tuned in today, we will be continuing this discussion on March 21st. So if you have not read Stephen's book, Chosen, A Memoir of Stolen Boyhood, I encourage you to buy it at a local bookstore, but then leave your review on Amazon and Goodreads and all those really popular websites. Dr. Julie, thank you so much for joining us today. You have a treasure trove of knowledge that I am sure our attendees loved. So thank you so much. And I hope you both have a wonderful evening. And I'm
going to put in a plug for Julie's trauma workbook, which is
amazing.
It's still one of my go-to books for just fantastic recommendations and very practical exercises for a lot of the things that we talked about.
Outstanding. And her website is being shared in the chat. So if you would like to learn more about Dr. Julie's workbook and her work, then please be sure to capture that website. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.